Usually when we talk about a famine or mass poverty or really any kind of sweeping demographic crisis, there's this ingrained expectation of natural inevitability.
Right, like it's just a force of nature.
Exactly. It's framed almost like a weather report. Like the rain stops, the crops wither, the earth just cracks open, and the observer points at the sky and says, well, there it is. Nature at work.
Hmm.
Tragic, but, entirely out of our hands.
It is deeply comforting, honestly, in a somewhat dark psychological way to frame human suffering as an act of God or a biological boundary.
Because then no one is to blame, right?
Precisely. If a crisis is purely natural, it is blameless. It completely absolves the people living in that society and, more importantly, the people actually running that society of any structural responsibility.
But then, and this is where today's topic gets really wild, you step into the world of 19th century political economy, and suddenly that innocent weather report looks like it might have been, well, completely fabricated in a boardroom somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. The framing shifts entirely.
We start looking at a demographic and social landscape that is, according to the stack of sources we are unpacking today, entirely manufactured.
We are diving into the absolute definition of economic muddy waters today. I mean, the 19th century was this period where the boundaries between natural law and economic policy were heavily contested and often deliberately blurred by the people in power.
And that is exactly where our deep dive is taking us today. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us, specifically focusing on excerpts from the Marx and Engels collected works, often referred to as the MECW.
It's a dense stack of reading, for sure.
It really is. But our mission today is to explore their writings on demography, forced emigration, and their incredibly fierce critique of Malthusianism. We're going to unpack their argument that poverty, starvation, and overpopulation are not these inevitable natural laws, but rather manufactured byproducts of specific economic systems.
It's a total paradigm shift from how people were taught to think back then.
Definitely. Now, just as a quick roadmap for you as we head into this material, we are looking at heavily debated, highly politically charged Marxist economic theory.
Yes, very sure.
These texts contain extremely sharp critiques of capitalist class structures. So our goal today isn't to take a political side, nor are we here to tell you what to believe.
Right. We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are approaching this neither from a left-wing perspective nor a right-wing perspective. We are simply acting as neutral guides. Our job is to impartially report on and translate the ideas contained within these historical texts so you can fully grasp the underlying mechanics of the arguments Marx and Engels were actually making.
And setting this historical stage is vital before we dig into all that theory. To understand these texts, we really have to mentally step back into the mid to late 19th century.
Paint that picture for us. What does that world look like?
Well, this is the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. You have explosive growth, the steam engine is completely rewiring human capability. Factories are rising up everywhere, and world trade is expanding at just a breakneck pace.
It sounds like a boom time.
It was, but alongside this staggering, unprecedented wealth, you have crushing, unbelievable inequality.
Right, so you have soaring productivity on one hand and squalid, disease-ridden slums on the other.
Yes, and modern political economy is essentially born in this exact contradiction. Thinkers of the era were scrambling to explain, or in some cases, to mathematically justify how a society could produce so much wealth while simultaneously generating so much visible human misery.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the man whose ideas Marx and Engels were reacting against with such intense hostility, and that is Thomas Robert Malthus.
Ah, yes, Malthus.
He was an English parson and a political economist, and he came up with a theory of population that essentially became the dominant economic dogma of the era. I want to build out his premise because it sounds almost like a terrifying logic puzzle.
It really does. So, Malthus published his famous essay on the principle of population at the very end of the 18th century, and he laid out a deeply pessimistic, seemingly irrefutable mathematical formula.
Okay, lay the math on me. What was the formula?
He claimed that human population, when left unchecked, naturally grows in a geometric progression.
So we're talking about compounding multiplication. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, then 16, 32, 64. It spirals up fast.
Exactly. While at the exact same time, he argued, the productive power of the land, meaning humanity's physical ability to grow food and extract subsistence from the earth, only increases in an arithmetic progression.
Arithmetic, meaning addition.
Right. It can only be added to incrementally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Wow. Okay, so if you project those two lines on a graph, The human population line is just sprinting upward exponentially,
Uh,
while the food supply line is taking single, steady, linear steps.
yes, and they're going to cross very quickly.
And the space where those lines cross is where the tragedy happens, right?
That's the Malthusian trap. His bleak conclusion was that human population will always, inevitably, press against the means of subsistence. There will always structurally be more mouths to feed than food to feed them.
So it's not a glitch, it's a feature of biology.
According to him, yes. Therefore, according to Malthusian logic, poverty, vice, starvation, and misery are not the result of bad government.
Huh.
They are not the result of unequal wealth distribution or, exploitative labor practices. They are eternal biological inevitabilities. It is a harsh law of nature.
The sources quote a specific metaphor Malthus uses, and it is honestly chilling. It reads less like an economic theory and more like a bouncer at a very exclusive, very cruel club.
The feast metaphor.
Yeah. Malthus wrote that a man who is born into a world already possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents and a society does not want his labor, has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food.
It's brutal.
He says this man comes to the, quote, feast of nature and finds no cover laid for him, and nature, quote, bids him be gone.
Bids him be gone. Just go away and starve.
It basically states that if you were born poor, you are biologically surplus to the Earth's carrying capacity, and your starvation is just the Earth balancing its books.
It is incredibly grim. But we have to look at how this philosophy translated into actual policy, because it wasn't just abstract math for academic debate.
It had real-world consequences.
Massive consequences. Malthus actively argued against the social safety nets of his day. He believed that charities and poor rates, which were the local welfare systems in England, were not just nonsensical, but actively destructive.
Let me guess the logic here. If you give a starving person a loaf of bread, you aren't solving poverty, you are just delaying the inevitable.
It goes further than that, actually. Malthus argued that by giving the poor food and money, you are keeping, quote, surplus people alive long enough to breed.
Oh, wow. So charity is bad because it creates more people.
Exactly. And because they breed geometrically, that one saved life turns into 4, and then 8 more surplus lives that the Earth cannot support.
That is a dark way to view a soup kitchen.
Right. So in his view, giving to charity was actually cruelty disguised as kindness. It was just compounding the future starvation. The most humane thing society could do in this twisted framework was to let nature take its course and let the surplus population die off.
Looking at this purely analytically, I have to imagine this theory was wildly popular with a very specific demographic of people in the 19th century.
Oh, the wealthy loved it. The texts point out the absolute, almost suspicious convenience of this theory for the ruling classes. It provided a completely bulletproof scientific justification for hard-heartedness.
Because it's just science. You can't argue with math.
Exactly. Imagine you are a factory owner or a wealthy aristocrat and you are stepping over starving children in the streets of London or Manchester. Malthus essentially whispers in your ear, hey, do not feel guilty. You did not cause this. Your economic system did not cause this. Nature did this.
It completely insulates the wealthy from any moral or structural responsibility for the poverty surrounding them. It turns human suffering into a law of physics. But the sources note that Marx and Engels didn't just disagree with the math. They attacked Malthus's credibility directly. They essentially called him a fraud.
Oh, they were merciless in their critique. Marx and Engels openly accused Malthus of plagiarism.
Really? Plagiarism?
Yes. They argued that he lifted the core of his population theory from earlier, more original thinkers, guys like Joseph Townsend and James Anderson, and then he just repackaged it for a very specific political purpose.
The text mentioned Marx calling Malthus's work a lampoon against the ideals of the French Revolution.
The timing is crucial here. Malthus published his first edition in 1798.
Okay, so the French Revolution is fresh in everyone's mind.
Exactly. The French Revolution had just terrified the European aristocracy, and there were all these utopian thinkers running around, people like William Godwin arguing that society could be perfected, that poverty could be eradicated through reason and equality.
And Malthus throws a wet blanket on all that.
A heavy mathematical wet blanket. Marx and Engels viewed Malthus as a sycophant for the British aristocracy. They argue he cobbled together this plagiarized, pessimistic theory specifically to crush those utopian ideals.
It was a political weapon.
Totally. It was a tool to defend the church, the state, and the landed elite. Basically saying, don't try to change the social order, guys. Biology won't let you.
Okay, I want to push back for just a second, or at least, play devil's advocate, because I think it's important to understand why this idea took hold so strongly.
Sure, go ahead.
Isn't there some basic logic to the Malthusian premise? Let's take it out of the 19th century and put it on a hypothetical island.
Okay, an island.
Yeah, an island. If you have an island with a fixed number of apple trees, and the human population on that island keeps doubling every 20 years, eventually, too many people means someone is going to starve.
Right.
It's like a game of musical chairs, and nature only built so many chairs. Doesn't the math eventually catch up to us?
That is exactly why the theory was, and honestly still is, in various forms, so persuasive.
Because it makes intuitive sense.
Right. If you accept the premise that the Earth is a closed, static system, an island with a fixed, unchangeable number of apples, then the math is irrefutable. But the texts we are examining show Marx and Engels completely rejecting that foundational premise.
They don't accept the island analogy.
Not at all. They don't just tweak the math. They attack the idea that the number of chairs is fixed in the first place.
Because they introduce a massive, game-changing variable that Malthus totally ignored in his calculations. And that variable is science.
Precisely. Where is the proof, Engels asks, that the productive power of the land only grows arithmetically?
Yeah, who says it only grows 1, 2, 3, 4?
Exactly. The sources highlight Engels, pointing to the massive leaps in agricultural science that were happening right in front of them. The texts specifically mention chemists from that era, like Sir Humphrey Davy and Justus von Liebig.
Okay, so what were Davy and Liebig actually doing that fundamentally challenged the Malthusian math?
They were essentially inventing modern agricultural chemistry. Before them, farming was largely based on tradition and, observation. You planted crops, the soil eventually got tired, you let it rest, maybe you added manure.
It was a very natural, limited cycle.
Yeah, it was a linear, limited process. But Liebig, for example, figured out the actual chemical composition of soil. He discovered that plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
The building blocks.
Yes, and by understanding this, humans could synthesize fertilizers. They could take a completely barren piece of land and make it artificially fertile. They could double or triple the yield of an acre of land that had previously been considered tapped out.
Wow. So Engels is looking at this and saying, wait a minute, science doesn't just grow arithmetically either. He argues that science advances in a geometric progression, just like population.
He states that science grows in proportion to the knowledge bequeathed by the previous generation. It compounds.
That makes perfect sense. Knowledge isn't a linear addition. When someone invents the steam engine, the next generation doesn't have to reinvent the steam engine from scratch. They take the steam engine and they invent the railway.
Exactly.
And the generation after that takes the railway and invents the combustion engine. It builds upon itself exponentially.
So the logic follows perfectly. If the population is growing geometrically, the scientific and technological capacity to feed that population is also growing geometrically.
The food line curves up too.
Yes. Engels argues that humanity's productive power is not a fixed arithmetic line. It is effectively immeasurable, limited only by the current state of science, which is always expanding.
He even brings in geography to make this point concrete, doesn't he?
He does.
The sources note Engels pointing out how absurd it was for Malthusians to talk about absolute global overpopulation when, at that time in the mid-19th century, the Mississippi Valley alone could theoretically produce enough food to hold the entire population of Europe.
It's a great geographical reality check. He highlights that only a third of the Earth was even being cultivated at the time, and even that third, using the chemical agricultural improvements they already knew about, could have its production raised sixfold.
So they weren't even close to the ceiling.
Not even remotely. The physical limit of the Earth was nowhere near being reached.
Which brings us to an incredible paradox. A massive, glaring contradiction that Marx and Engels use to just shatter the Malthusian illusion.
This is where it gets really sharp.
If the Earth can produce more than enough food, how do you explain the very real starvation happening in the streets of London? In the texts, they identify this bizarre phenomenon of the capitalist-era economic crises caused by overproduction.
This is the crux of their critique. In previous historical eras, a crisis was caused by a lack of things. A drought caused a lack of wheat, so people starved.
Right, a genuine shortage.
But in the 19th century, they were witnessing crises where there was an overproduction of goods. The factories were churning out too much cloth, the industrial farms were producing massive amounts of food, and yet there was widespread unemployment, homelessness, and starvation.
Think about the world you live in today. How often do you hear arguments that we simply don't have enough resources or that the earth is too full, while simultaneously reading reports about massive systemic food waste?
It's staggering.
Or reading about agricultural policies where farmers are subsidized to destroy crops in order to keep market prices stable. It's that exact same paradox. You have too much stuff and people who desperately need the stuff, but the two cannot connect.
What's fascinating here is that for Marx and Engels, that paradox is the smoking gun. It proves that the overpopulation the Malthusians are terrified of is not an absolute biological fact. It is a highly artificial, historically specific economic condition.
It's made up.
According to our sources, the Malthusian biological boogeyman was championed so that political economists wouldn't have to look in the mirror.
Because if they admitted that starvation was happening amidst absolute plenty, their entire theoretical system of free competition and private property would collapse.
Right.
They would have to admit the system was broken. So they blamed the victim's biology instead.
Exactly.
But this leaves us with a massive question. If nature isn't the culprit, what is? If the physical limits of the earth aren't manufacturing this surplus population, what is generating all these unemployed, starving people?
The texts provide Marx's direct answer to this. He states that overpopulation is a specifically capitalist phenomenon.
Okay, lay that out.
It is not a natural law of biology. It is a historical law of the capitalist mode of production.
Okay, we need to dive deep into the mechanics of this because this is where the theory gets incredibly granular. Let's try to build a model based on the text. Marx argues that the capitalist system has a relentless built-in drive to accumulate capital.
The foundational rule of capitalism in this framework is competition. To survive as a capitalist, you must constantly produce goods cheaper and faster than your rivals.
Or you go bankrupt.
Right. If you don't, you go out of business. So how do you increase your productive power? You do it by revolutionizing the way things are made, specifically by introducing better machinery and new technology.
Right. And Marx divides a capitalist's investment into two categories. There is constant capital, which is the money spent on machinery, buildings, and raw materials. And there is variable capital, which is the money spent on human labor, on wages.
Those two categories are key to understanding the mechanism.
Let's ground this in a scenario to make it make sense. Imagine I own a mid-19th century shoe factory. I currently employ 50 cobblers who make shoes entirely by hand.
Okay, a traditional setup.
My variable capital, my labor cost is very high. But then a new steam-powered leather stitching machine is invented. If I buy that machine, I am drastically increasing my constant capital. But the machine is so efficient that I now only need 10 workers to operate it, and those 10 workers can produce twice as many shoes as the original 50 cobblers did.
That is the exact mechanism Marx is describing. As the capitalist accumulates more capital and invests in better machinery, the ratio of the investment changes. The constant capital grows massively, while the variable capital, the demand for human labor, relatively shrinks.
So what happens to the 40 cobblers I just fired? Because I don't need them anymore.
The machinery, as Marx phrases it in the sources, sets free those laborers. They are thrown out of the factory doors and onto the street.
Sets free. That's a very polite way of saying they lose their livelihood.
It's heavy irony on Marx's part. And this structural, continuous shift in how production is organized artificially manufactures what Marx calls a relative surplus population. He also refers to it as the industrial reserve army.
The word relative is doing a lot of heavy listing there.
It is the most important word in the concept. These 40 fired cobblers are not surplus to the Earth's ability to feed them. The Earth is producing plenty of wheat. They are only surplus to capital's immediate need to exploit them for profit.
Because I, the factory owner, can't squeeze a profit out of their hand stitching anymore.
Exactly, because you cannot make a profit off their hand-cobbling labor anymore. They are deemed economically superfluous. They are cut off from the wage system, which means they are cut off from the means of subsistence. They become a surplus population relative to the needs of capital accumulation.
This industrial reserve army concept is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like a professional sports team maintaining a massive, sprawling bench of backup players.
That's a good analogy.
But in this scenario, the backup players aren't just sitting there collecting a paycheck while they wait for their turn. This bench is literally starving.
Right, they're fighting for survival.
And here is where the dynamic gets truly insidious. Because there are thousands of desperate people sitting on that starving bench, their sheer numbers force the starting players, the people who actually have jobs inside the factory, to accept terrible contracts.
They lose all their bargaining power.
Exactly. The workers on the floor have to accept longer hours, worse conditions, and stagnant wages just to keep their spot. Because the moment a worker complains, the factory owner can just point to the window at the massive crowd of starving people outside and say, hey, if you don't like the wages, there are 100 guys out there who will take your job for half the pay.
The sources explicitly highlight this function. The Reserve Army acts as a dead weight on the active labor force. During periods of average economic activity, this surplus population suppresses the wages of the employed workers.
It's a built-in wage ceiling.
Yes. It structurally guarantees that the workers who are employed can never demand a larger share of the wealth they are creating, because the competition for survival is just so artificially fierce.
But I want to challenge this from the perspective of the factory owner. Surely capitalists don't actually want a massive population of starving, destitute people outside their gates.
You'd think so, right?
I mean, from a purely macroeconomic standpoint, a starving population doesn't buy shoes. You need consumers to buy the commodities you are overproducing. Doesn't this system eventually cannibalize itself?
You are identifying a core contradiction that Marx explores, but the texts make it clear that individual capital doesn't operate on a long-term macroeconomic moral horizon.
Short-sighted.
Very. Capital is driven by the immediate compulsory laws of competition. Marx quotes the phrase, après moi le déluge, after me, the flood.
Oh.
The individual capitalist doesn't care about the lifespan, the health, or the long-term purchasing power of the working class as a whole. They care about extracting maximum surplus value today to survive tomorrow's competition.
So it's adapt and exploit today or die tomorrow.
Exactly. Furthermore, the texts argue that this massive reserve army isn't just a side effect, it is an absolute requirement for the capitalist system to function, specifically because of the system's erratic business cycles.
Ah, the boom and bust cycles. The sources refer to these as the paroxysms of industry.
Paroxysms. Great word. The capitalist economy doesn't grow at a steady arithmetic pace. It expands violently and contracts violently. Imagine a sudden new market opens up, say, a massive new railway network is approved, or a new colony is open for trade.
Suddenly there's huge demand.
Right? Capital needs to expand production instantly to capture that new market.
If you get a sudden order for 1 million pairs of shoes, you can't wait 20 years for a new generation of workers to be born and raised. You need labor right now.
And where does that instantly available massive block of human labor come from?
The bench.
It comes from the Industrial Reserve Army. The capitalist pulls thousands of people off that starving bench, throws them into the new factories, works them to the bone for 3 or 4 years during the boom, and then as soon as the market is saturated and the bust cycle hits, those workers are spat back out into the reserve army.
It is a profoundly brutal mechanic.
It really is.
The text described this as a system that requires a constantly available, disposable mass of human material. Marx writes about it being a constant current of quickly fading generations of people, plucked before maturity, used up rapidly by the machines, and discarded.
That quote is striking.
It paints an incredibly grim picture of the origins of this system. The texts say that capital comes into the world, quote, dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt.
A very famous line.
So we have established this manufactured crisis, a massive demographic of people who are deemed surplus because the machinery of capital has made their labor redundant. How does this system resolve this immense pressure? If millions of people cannot work and therefore cannot eat, where do they go? What is the release valve?
According to the sources, the capitalist system resolves this manufactured pressure by driving away the surplus population through forced emigration, or by simply allowing them to be decimated by famine and disease.
Emigration is a major theme in these texts.
Yeah.
And the sources draw a really fascinating contrast between how compulsory emigration worked in the ancient world versus how it functions in the modern capitalist era. It completely flips the narrative of why people leave their homes.
Marx provides a brilliant historical comparison here. He looks at ancient states, like Greece and Rome, where compulsory emigration, sending large groups of citizens off to establish new colonies was a regular, systemic part of society.
Right.
But he asks, why did the ancients do it? They did it because they suffered from a genuine want of productive power.
A lack of technology.
Exactly. The ancient Romans didn't have chemical fertilizers or steam-powered tractors. They had a hard, absolute biological limit on what their land could produce. If their population grew beyond that limit, the excess citizens would strain the resources to the point where free men would be reduced to doing the bodily drudgery of slaves just to survive.
So in the ancient world, Malthus's math actually kind of applied.
Yeah.
They were forced to leave because of a genuine lack of production. They hit the ceiling of their technology.
Right.
But modern compulsory emigration under capitalism, The mass migrations of the 19th century happened for the exact opposite reason.
Yes. The texts emphasize that 19th century workers weren't forced onto ships because their society didn't have enough wealth or productive power. They were forced to leave because there was a massive increase in productive power.
The steam engines and the power looms were producing too much, too efficiently, making the human worker totally redundant.
As Marx puts it in just a brilliant inversion of the Malthusian logic, it is not population that presses on productive power, it is productive power that presses on population. The machinery itself, the accumulated capital, is literally pushing people off the land and out of the country.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this leads us to what might be the most hypocritical dynamic detailed in the entire stack of sources.
The hypocrisy is stunning.
We have this reserve army of labor. The political economists preaching their Malthusian gospel are standing on their soapboxes saying there are simply too many workers. Nature dictates they must starve. The only humane solution is to encourage them to emigrate to the colonies.
Right, that was the public narrative.
But what actually happens when the workers are given the opportunity to leave? The texts detail a specific, glaring historical event, the Lancashire cotton crisis.
The cotton crisis is a perfect, almost laboratory-like historical example of how capital actually views its surplus population.
Set the scene for us.
So, during the American Civil War in the early 1860s, the Union Navy blockaded Confederate ports. This meant the supply of raw, slave-picked cotton to the British textile mills completely dried up.
So the massive mills in Lancashire, which is the heart of the British industrial engine at the time, just grind to a halt.
Almost overnight. And the workers in those mills are suddenly thrown onto the streets. They are completely destitute, facing literal starvation. Now, according to Malthusian logic, this is a clear case of overpopulation. The jobs are gone, the means of subsistence are gone, these people are now surpluses.
They're the extra guests at the feast of nature.
Exactly. And public opinion in Britain, seeing the horrific suffering in Lancashire, actually mobilized to urge emigration. Politicians and commentators suggested using public funds to help these starving textile workers buy passage to the colonies, to Australia or North America, where they could find land and survive.
Okay, that sounds like a rational Malthusian solution.
But the manufacturers, the factory owners who had just fired all these people and were letting them starve, threw an absolute fit. They actively lobbied Parliament and fought tooth and nail against any public assistance for emigration.
Wait, really? Why would they do that? If you believe there are too many people, why stop them from leaving?
Because the factory owners understood the actual mechanics of their own system much better than the Malthusian economists did.
Oh, they knew what they were doing.
Oh, yeah. The manufacturers realized that these starving workers were not a biological excess. They were a vital economic asset. The texts, quote, the manufacturers calling the workers their, quote, mental and trained power.
They were the living component of the factory's capital.
Precisely. The factory owners knew that the American Civil War would eventually end. The cotton supply would eventually return. And when it did, they would need to restart their massive, expensive mills.
And you can't run a mill without workers.
Right. If the cream of the workers, the highly trained spinners and weavers, were allowed to emigrate to Australia, the owners' fixed capital, their millions of pounds worth of machinery, would instantly depreciate. The machines were useless without the specific, disciplined labor force required to operate them at high speeds.
So even while the workers were literally starving in the streets, the capitalists viewed them as a hoarded resource. They essentially demanded that the government keep the workers trapped in England, starving on a miserable drip feed of meager charity, just in case the factories opened up again next year.
That's exactly what happened.
It perfectly illustrates how, under this system, the human being is stripped of all humanity and treated as a mere commodity. The sources use the term faux frais, an incidental expense of capital production.
Faux frais.
It is exactly like keeping a specialized tool in your garden shed. You don't care if the tool is slowly rusting in the damp, cold dark. You just want to make absolutely sure it is sitting there on the shelf when you finally need to turn a screw.
It's a great analogy, and if we connect the Lancashire cotton crisis to the broader theoretical picture, it completely exposes the Malthusian defense as a self-serving myth.
How so?
Well, if overpopulation was truly a natural biological law causing the starvation, the ruling class would want the surplus to leave to restore the natural balance.
Right, get them out.
But the fact that capital required the surplus to stay, by force if necessary, proves that the surplus was an economic requirement for their profit margins, not a biological excess.
That is just wild. To really drive this theory home, to take it out of the realm of abstract economics and show what it looked like on the ground, our sources provide two incredibly visceral historical examples.
Real-world case studies.
Yeah, these are real-world tragedies that show what primitive accumulation and forced immigration look like when applied with absolute ruthlessness. Let's look at the first example, Scotland.
The sources spend significant time analyzing the clearing of the Scottish estates, and they focus specifically on the actions of the Duchess of Sutherland. This is presented as a textbook, glaring example of what Marx calls primitive accumulation.
So based on these texts, primitive accumulation sounds less like a slow, natural process of people saving their pennies in a piggy bank to build a business, and more like a violent, state-sanctioned land grab designed to force independent people into becoming desperate wage laborers. Am I reading that right?
You are reading it exactly right. Primitive accumulation is the historical, often violent process of divorcing the producer from the means of production.
Taking away their tools and land.
Exactly. Before the capitalist factory system can fully function, it needs that massive reserve army of people who have absolutely nothing to sell to survive except their own bodily labor.
Okay, so what happened in Scotland?
In the Scottish Highlands, you had thousands of crofters, peasant farmers, who lived in clan systems. They had lived on and cultivated their ancestral lands for centuries. They weren't wealthy, but they had direct access to their means of subsistence. The land.
But then the aristocracy does some math.
Yes. The Duchess of Sutherland and other aristocratic landowners realized that the global market had changed. The booming textile mills in England needed wool.
Wool.
Yes. The landowners realized they could extract vastly more profit by turning their massive estates over to large-scale industrial sheep farming than they ever could by collecting small rents from thousands of peasant farmers.
So they just erased the people.
They did.
The texts describe a process of merciless expropriation. The Duchess of Sutherland orchestrated the clearing of roughly 15,000 inhabitants. They didn't just ask them to leave. They used the law, and when the law wasn't fast enough, they used fire. Villages were systematically burned to the ground. Fields that had grown food for generations were converted into massive pastures. Those 15,000 people were violently driven from their homes and replaced by 131,000 sheep.
It's devastating. The inhabitants were pushed to the barren coastal areas and told to become fishermen, or they were forced onto ships to emigrate.
To make room for sheep.
Consider the Malthusian lens here. Did those 15,000 Scottish Highlanders suddenly breed too fast for the soil to support them? Did nature suddenly decide the land was exhausted?
Not at all. The land was immensely productive.
But its product was no longer meant for the people living on it. The land was repurposed to serve the global capitalist market. The Highlanders weren't made surplus by biology, they were made surplus by a ledger book that declared sheep were more profitable than human tenants.
It was a business decision.
It was a purely economic eviction, enforced by state violence, which Malthusian economists then politely categorized as a natural demographic shift.
And then we move to the second historical example, which is perhaps one of the most profound demographic events of the 19th century, Ireland and the tragedy of the potato famine.
Yes, Ireland.
The sources show how the Irish experience proved the Malthusians completely wrong on a staggering, unprecedented scale.
The Malthusian economists had always maintained a very cynical stance on emigration as a solution to poverty. They predicted that emigration could never actually solve a population problem because, they argued, humans would always breed faster than ships could theoretically carry them away.
So even if you send people away, they just keep multiplying at home.
Right. They believed the biological urge to reproduce would always outpace the logistical capacity of the shipping industry.
But Ireland proved them utterly wrong.
Completely wrong. Following the blight that caused the potato crop to fail in 1845, Ireland experienced a catastrophic famine. Roughly 1 million people died of starvation and disease in a very short period.
Horrific numbers.
But what followed was an exodus that defied all Malthusian expectations. Over the next few decades, millions of Irish people successfully emigrated, primarily to North America and Britain. They emptied the country at a rate that far exceeded the natural birth rate. Ireland's population plummeted and never recovered to its pre-famine levels.
But the truly astounding part of this demographic shift, as the texts point out, is the specific economic mechanism of how this massive exodus was financed.
This is a crucial detail.
It wasn't the British state, with all its imperial wealth, that paid to relocate these desperate people.
No, the British government offered minimal, often punitive assistance. The mass evacuation of Ireland was financed by the poverty-stricken Irish themselves.
How does a starving population afford transatlantic ship tickets? Doesn't make sense.
Through an extraordinary system of remittances.
Explain that.
The first wave of immigrants, often the youngest and strongest of a family, went to America. They took the most brutal, lowest-paying labor jobs available. They lived in abject squalor, saved every single penny they could extract from their wages, and then sent that money back across the Atlantic to pay for the passage of their siblings, their parents, their neighbors.
Wow.
The Irish diaspora essentially funded their own mass evacuation through sheer collective willpower and self-exploitation.
It is an incredible testament to human solidarity. And from a theoretical standpoint, it completely shatters the Malthusian worldview. The Malthusians treated humans like unthinking variables in a cold biological equation, just, mouth havers who blindly consume and reproduce until they hit a wall.
Right, like bacteria in a petri dish.
Exactly. But the Irish proved they were active, conscious agents who would sacrifice absolutely everything, endure unimaginable hardship in a new world, just to save their loved ones from the Malthusian trap.
Furthermore, the texts use the Irish famine to prove that the miseries of starvation were the direct result of the bourgeois mode of production and British colonial exploitation, not a natural lack of food.
This is a crucial point to clarify, because when we think of a famine, we think of a total absence of food.
Naturally.
But what was actually happening in Ireland during the worst years of the starvation?
While the potato crop, which was the subsistence food for the poorest laborers, failed, Ireland was simultaneously producing massive quantities of grain, wheat, oats, and livestock.
But the starving people weren't eating it. Why?
Because that agricultural wealth did not belong to the people who grew it.
Who did it belong to?
It belonged to the landlords, many of whom were British and lived entirely outside of Ireland. Under the strict laws of capitalist private property enforced by the British military, that food was a commodity. It was harvested, loaded onto carts, guarded by armed soldiers as it was driven past starving families dying in the ditches, and loaded onto ships at the docks to be exported to England, where it could fetch a higher market price.
Let me get this straight. The food was right there. They were literally watching it leave the island.
Yes.
So the starvation was not caused by a physical lack of calories on the island. It was caused by a lack of money among the peasantry to buy the food that was being shipped right past their starving eyes.
Exactly. The Irish famine completely dismantled the Malthusian defense of natural starvation. It proved that in a capitalist system, food does not flow to where there is hunger, it flows to where there is capital.
It follows the money.
If you don't have capital, the system treats you as a surplus entity, even if you are standing in the middle of a field of wheat.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of historical and theoretical ground today. Let's try to pull all these threads together and summarize the journey we've been on through these texts. We started with Thomas Malthus, who looked at the horrific poverty of the Industrial Revolution and essentially blamed nature.
Right.
He claimed that human biology simply outpaces the Earth's arithmetic ability to produce food, making starvation an untouchable law of physics that conveniently absolved the ruling class of any guilt.
But then we examined the counter-arguments from Marx and Engels, who flipped that script entirely. They demonstrated that science, technology, and agricultural chemistry grow geometrically too, meaning the Earth has an effectively immeasurable productive capacity.
Which means the surplus population isn't a biological excess. It is a specifically manufactured requirement of the capitalist system.
As capitalists relentlessly invest in new machinery to stay competitive, they constantly replace human labor. This structural shift creates the Industrial Reserve Army, a massive pool of unemployed and underemployed workers.
The bench.
The bench. This army is kept desperate in order to drive down the wages of the active workers and to provide a disposable, instantly available labor force for the erratic boom and bust paroxysms of the market.
And we saw how the system attempts to resolve this crisis of its own making through forced emigration and famine, while simultaneously acting with stunning hypocrisy, like the Lancashire mill owners trying to keep the workers trapped and starving when it suits their long-term profit margins. The tragic clearances in Scotland and the horrors of the Irish potato famine weren't biological destinies. They were the cold, violent economic byproducts of a system that values the accumulation of capital over human life. So, what does this all mean? Why does unpacking this specific historical critique matter to you listening to this today?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, It matters because the core rhetorical trick of Malthusianism has never really gone away.
It's still with us.
Very much so. Whenever you hear someone in a position of power blame natural laws or inherent human nature or inevitable demographic trends for modern problems, whether it's poverty, massive inequality, or the lack of affordable resources, you have to ask, who benefits from that specific explanation?
Follow the motive.
Just as Malthus provided a convenient pseudoscientific excuse for the 19th century industrialists to ignore the slums they built, modern versions of these biological or natural arguments often serve the exact same purpose. They are designed to protect the current economic status quo from systemic critique. They train you to look at the sky and blame the weather instead of looking at the boardroom where the policies are made.
It teaches us to aggressively look for the engineered economic systems hiding behind what we are told are just natural disasters. But before we officially sign off, our expert has pulled one final, incredibly fascinating historical prediction from the very end of our source material.
Yes, I have.
It's something that builds on everything we've discussed, and it's something for you to mull over.
So in 1894, near the end of his life, Friedrich Engels was analyzing the outbreak of the war between China and Japan. And applying the exact theories of capital accumulation and forced immigration we've just spent an hour discussing, he made a staggering prediction about the future of global labor.
What did he predict?
He foresaw the impending collapse of the old China. He predicted that the inevitable introduction of European railways, steam engines, and large-scale capitalist industry into China would rapidly dissolve their ancient, incredibly dense system of small farm agriculture.
Because the hyper-efficient capitalist mode of production would penetrate the country, outcompete the peasant farmers, and completely shatter their traditional way of life.
Exactly. And he predicted that this process would cause millions of Chinese workers to be violently evicted from their land. They would become a massive new relative surplus population. And he predicted they would be compelled to emigrate, arriving in Europe and America, as he put it, in droves, desperately seeking wage labor to survive.
So a massive globalized reserve army.
Yes. But here is the ultimate dialectical twist for you to consider. Engels didn't just predict the modern globalization of the labor market. He predicted that this ultimate conquest of China by global capitalism would cause such massive, unprecedented competition on the world labor market that it would actually provide the very impulse for the overthrow of capitalism in Europe and America.
Wait, really? So the idea is that capitalist expansion creates the very forces that will eventually undermine it.
That's the theory.
It's like an engine that is designed to run faster and faster, but eventually it shakes itself to pieces.
Right.
By conquering the globe, it builds an industrial reserve army so massive and drives wages down so universally that the system can simply no longer contain the human pressure it has manufactured.
It is a profound historical hypothesis. The drive for infinite accumulation inevitably hits a limit. But that limit is not of nature's making, as Malthus claimed. It is a limit born of the system's own internal contradictions.
Think back to our opening metaphor, that weather report that told us the drought and the suffering were just natural occurrences we had to passively accept. Through these texts, we've realized the weather machine is real, it's man-made, and it's being operated by a specific economic system. The question Engels leaves us with at the end of his life is, what happens when the pressure inside that machine builds so high that it finally breaks down?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the natural laws of the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.